Thank you all for getting back from lunch here. My name is Jay Rosenthal. I am a partner at Mitchell, Silverberg & Knupp out of the DC office, and I am a former executive vice president and general counsel at the National Music Publishers Association and general counsel for a group called the Recording Artists Coalition, which was a political group started by Don Henley and Irving Azoff and a whole bunch of other top-line artists who were upset with the way the labels are treating them. Not like that's changed, but they were upset about 15, 20 years ago. I want to thank you all for inviting me to New Orleans again, to Cutting Edge. When I come here, what I try and do is to give an inside the Beltway view of what's going on in Washington that impacts the music community. I think without exaggeration, we're in the most active period of copyright reform I've ever seen, and really that anybody who's in the music industry has ever experienced. I'm sure others who work for the publishers and the labels will attest to they're probably doing more thinking about public policy than hey, let's change our licensing processes. They're trying to figure out what the hell is going on in Washington. Did I just sound like Donald Trump there? What the hell is going on in Washington?
It's rigged.
That's right. It's rigged. Just believe me. That's all I ask. Listen, whether it's Congress, the Copyright Office, the Commerce Department, the USPTO, the Department of Justice, the White House, the new Trump Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, which is opening next week or next month, the amount of activity is unprecedented. And what I'm going to try and give you in the short amount of time I have is a snapshot of some of the more important copyright reform and political developments in Washington, and a sense of how this is going to impact the music industry down the road. Now, as I go through the topics, I have no problems taking a question for each of the topics, but I'll also take questions at the end. Because I am going to be jumping into different types of activity in Washington, and you'll kind of get the flavor of that as we move on. The topics I am going to address: the ASCAP BMI consent decree reformation process at the Department of Justice, a little bit about the Copyright Royalty Board Web 4 rate setting process, very controversial decision that's on appeal. The Copyright Office Section 512 DMCA study focusing on notice and takedown practice. The American Law Institute's Restatement of Copyright Law Initiative. I'm sure most of you don't even know that there is a process that they're going through right now to create a restatement of copyright law that should interest every litigator in the room. And a little bit about international affairs, and specifically focusing on, and remember the Bernie signs, TPP. Well, I'm going to talk about TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Treaty. All the issues you heard about were about things like labor and jobs going overseas. I'm going to talk a little bit about the IP aspect of this and the copyright issues that are involved. Now, just to give you a sense of what I'm not going to talk about, and yet is just all over Washington now and has been for the past couple of years and will be, the Copyright Office also has studies on music licensing, which they've published and we'll discuss a little, orphan works, mass digitization, the making available right, Section 108 exceptions for libraries and archives, Section 1201 exceptions about putting copyrighted works and material in cars, for instance, and other products, Copyright Office modernization, mandatory copyright deposits of sound recordings, which everybody should know about that, and one aspect which I can talk about in the question and answer section, but it is the only area that I think will pass very soon, and that is there's a bill out there to create a copyright small claims court. This is fascinating and something everybody should be watching because it could really help a lot of your clients if they want to get in. It's a voluntary system, but it is out there. At the USPTO, you have the recently released Green Paper, which focuses on the proposed mashup digital sample compulsory license and the first sale doctrine and changes to statutory damages. You have the Copyright Royalty Board proceeding on Section 115 mechanical royalty rates. That's become incredibly controversial because the position Sony Music has taken that they want to get in the room to negotiate interactive licenses that usually occur between the publishers and the services themselves. They want to now be in the room, so there's a lot of controversy about that. And add to that, congressional hearings. on the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, royalty rate parity under the Copyright Royalty Board rate setting process, and many other issues. And to add to all of that, they've just hired a new Librarian of Congress. Coming from the library community, this has been very controversial because the library community has been antagonistic towards copyright interest in the past. That's everything we're not going to talk about. What I will talk about, and what I'm going to start right now, is the DOJ. Talk about amazing controversial moments in Washington. I think it was an awful day with the recent DOJ ruling for publishers and songwriters. It is an even worse day for government. It is really a moment where you wonder why government gets involved in these issues, and I'm going to try and explain to you, it is not a legal issue that we're dealing with here, it is a political issue. And we'll talk about that in a second. But just to give you a flavor of the ASCAP BMI consent decrees, and I know the Braybecks are going to discuss that in their panels as well. So you'll get another piece of that. But these are consent decrees that have been placed in place over 70 years. They're the oldest consent decrees in the U.S. They allow the PROs to engage in blanket licensing of their catalogs for public performance of their music. Early last year, I think that's about the timing, ASCAP and BMI asked the DOJ to amend the consent decrees to allow publishers to partially withdraw their catalogs so they can enter into direct licenses with interactive streaming services. Publishers wanted to do this. They believed that in the free market they would get a higher royalty rate than what the Copyright Royalty Board under the compulsory licenses were giving them. And I agree with that. I think that every compulsory license, in my estimation, is below market value. So they wanted to get out there, get the royalty rates up in the free market. There was an amazing amount of lobbying of DOJ, seeking the right to partially withdraw, and this is exactly how they handle the music in Europe. So there were some pretty compelling reasons why they should do this. After almost 2 years of deliberation, the DOJ not only rejected the request and affirmed the consent decrees, they rejected the practice of fractional licensing. And this is an issue that impacts collaborative works by more than one writer. When songwriters represented by different PRO collaborate on a musical work, a user has to obtain licenses from both PROs. That's how the industry has worked. Everybody was fine with that. Nobody asked the DOJ to touch that, and yet they did. This issue has impacted numerous levels of contracts in this industry. Contracts between songwriters and the PROs, BMI and ASCAP. Deals between songwriters as to what the other can license and how they can issue public performance licenses. To change this practice is really going to be devastating to songwriters, publishers, the PROs, and even foreign public performance societies, because the way they handle this is different. This was all conveyed to DOJ. Yet DOJ ruled that not only will they not allow for the withdrawal of rights, but they are going to reinterpret the rule relating to fractional licensing to now require that the PROs offer licenses for 100% of any work. And this is going to be throwing the music publishing industry into serious chaos and uncertainty. Many commentators have pointed to the lead attorney involved, DOJ Deputy Director Renata Hesse, as the main supporter of this action, and she has been. Significantly, Renata Hesse was a former Google attorney. We'll get to the revolving door in a second. The DOJ recognized that this action forces songwriters, publishers, PROs to violate their own agreements, and that they're going to have to get back in and reformulate these agreements in one way or another. Now, they wanted to be nice about this. So instead of saying that you guys are violating the law now, and you have to change, we're going to give you a year to change your practices. It means that publishers will have to go in and do due diligence to find out what they can and can't do in relationship to their public performance society agreements, affiliation agreements. Songwriters are going to have to figure out what they're going to do with their collaborators. And then everybody's going to have to figure out how they deal with foreign rights. It's going to cost publishers millions of dollars to do this. It's going to cause songwriters thousands of dollars to do this. So that means that most won't. They will not engage in this right now, and because, quite simply, they can't afford to. So BMI is going to appeal this ruling, and ASCAP is going to look for a legislative fix. In the music community, there's been uniform condemnation of this particular ruling. The Copyright Office warned DOJ not to do it. All of the publishers strongly condemned the move. The trade associations, publishers, songwriters, they all were against this move. Even CISAC, the organization internationally that handles all of the international different territorial groups that deal with public performance, came out and basically said that instead of fixing the consent decrees, they've even made them worse. The legislative side of this, there is a Congressman, Doug Collins, who is very pro-copyright, pro-music, is going to try and introduce legislation to fix this, but other congressmen, traditional supporters of the tech user community, have sent a strong letter supporting the move, thus guaranteeing, as usually happens in Washington, D.C., gridlock on any kind of legislative fix. I mean, I hope there will be a legislative fix, but I kind of doubt it. What does this show you about Washington and music and beyond the consent decrees? On the lobbying front, we've always known that Google has come to D.C. in a big way. There are now more Google lobbyists on the ground than all the lobbyists representing the content industries combined. This is real. And the other companies have done the same thing. They have ramped up their lobbying efforts in Washington to an amazing degree. But it also exposes another problem in D.C., and that is the problem of the revolving door. Those working in industry, moving into government, those working in government, moving into industry. It's no mistake that most people, when looking at all of government, calls Washington the capital of the empire. This is what makes you look bad at the end of the day, and we're taking it on the music side because of this practice. According to Watchdog.org, more than 250 people have moved from Google and related firms to the federal government, or vice versa, since President Obama took office. The Google Transparency Project found 258 instances of the revolving door between Google or its associated companies and the federal government, national political campaigns, and Congress since 2009. 22 former White House officials have gone to work for Google in the past few years. 31 executives from Google and related firms went to work at the White House or were appointed to federal advisory boards by President Obama. Those boards include the President's Council on Science and Technology and the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. There have been 15 moves between Google and lobbying firms in the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission. These are not low-level Google employees. These are general counsels and technology officers. The aforementioned Renata Hesse, the mastermind of the DOJ consent decree ruling, was a member of Wilson Sonsini, a very pro-tech, pro-user law firm, and then became senior counsel to the chairman of transactions at the FCC, and now she has moved to DOJ and to run its antitrust division that relates to music. The same division and the same person who just ruled that the consent decrees must continue, that publishers cannot partially withdraw their catalogs to engage in free market negotiations like they do in Europe, and that 100% licensing, a mandatory practice that would force violation of literally thousands of pre-existing contracts and would shove the publishing industry into upheaval, is now required under the expanded interpretation of the consent decree. There's no doubt that Google and other pro-user, pro-tech interests lobby DOJ on these matters, and now they see it as a successful political strategy. They will continue to press the interest in other areas of DC beyond just the DOJ. I know that there's a lot of activity at the USPTO about copyright policy that contrasts directly with the positions and the theories and the legal results of studies that have been engaged in at the Copyright Office. Who are these people doing this? Mainly former Google executives. And it's even moved towards the elections. In the last year, or that's 2 years ago, there was a congressman running in Silicon Valley District, Derek Khanna, who basically ran on one topic. He had one issue under his platform. That issue was pushing back against the interest of copyright and the artist community. That was it. He didn't say that's in addition to, hey, I want, certain trade issues and I want, crime. It was all about copyright. What did you find out about this candidate? Most of the money came from Silicon Valley. Most of that was from Google. This is the future of politics in Washington. Google and the rest of the user community, they have arrived in an incredibly big way and an incredibly influential way. And while in the past, the content community has benefited by the fact that they were generally mostly the parties going to Capitol Hill to lobby on behalf of artists, songwriters, labels, publishers. That means less and less today. And you will see this. And by the way, this is not a left versus right issue. You see in Congress, progressives who are against copyright. You see conservatives against copyright. And you see conservatives and progressives in favor of copyright. Representative Goodlatte, who is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, is, I would think, and I think this is fair to say, a fairly pro-copyright congressman. And certainly you have progressives like John Conyers, who sits up there. It's a rare day that John Conyers sits there and agrees with Bob Goodlatte on Washington, but they do agree on copyright matters, and they are becoming the minority. And this is, again, what we face down the road with the DOJ and with everything else that they've been involved with. Before I go on to the next topic, any questions on the DOJ? We could talk about this at the end as well. If not, I'll continue. This is a little better news, the second topic. The Copyright Office Section 512 study on the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. This is all about takedown notices. The Copyright Office was asked by Congress to consider how to change the DMCA for the better. Significantly, they focused on how the notice and takedown process impacts holders, online service providers, and the general public, and how it works and how we can improve it. They also wanted to review whether Section 512, which is the DMCA, adequately addresses online infringement and protects against inappropriate takedown notices. So the office set up this process whereby the public would file written comments, followed by roundtable hearings in New York and San Francisco, which occurred this past May, and soon they're going to call for reply comments. And these reply comments will be in response to the initial submissions by the parties, as well as they'll ask new questions stemming from the hearings that were had. Now, this whole process seemed like a great thing to do. So how do you start the process? What happens? The office initially received 92,000 submissions by a deadline that was back in April for initial comments. Now, one would say that that seems peculiar. 92,000 submissions made by, are there even 92,000 people who care about this? And what they found out very clearly was one of the parties submitted on their own about 91,000 of them. It was basically a hacker group, and they tried to take down the Copyright Office system. They almost succeeded in that. The Copyright Office IT people kind of pushed back, and they all came in, but they were 91,000 submissions saying the same thing. Effectively, the DMCA sucks, or the DMCA is great, or whatever they want to say, but it's the same thing. It was done for political theater more than anything else. But there were a lot of legitimate submissions made by parties who are stakeholders in this particular debate. The pro-copyright camp getting involved in this, representing groups from all of the copyright industries, strongly criticizing the DMCA as being outdated and effectively unusable by most copyright owners, especially small copyright owners. This is one of the really big problems with the DMCA, and I'll get to why in a second. The biggest complaint that the system was initially developed to balance the interests of the copyright owners on the one side and users on the other. One of the key points, though, is that the system was developed before the invention of YouTube, and the scaling of use since then has made the system outdated and ineffective. And when I say scaling of use, I mean, who would have ever thought before YouTube that there would be the amount of content placed online? Because originally they thought the DMCA was going to work nicely. a couple of times someone would place something online on these small little services that were being created in 1997, and that the copyright owner could find out, and they would send them a little nice letter called a takedown notice, and they would take it down, and that particular service would be insulated from liability. They would create effectively a safe harbor against infringement liability. Why? Because they took it down when they were asked, and they have a program to take it down. Everybody thought this was great. And there's great language in the legislative history where these congressmen were saying, this is only going to happen a couple times, a couple takedown notices, no big deal, and we'll just press forward with all of this. And that system also had, at the beginning of the DMCA, protections for copyright owners if a service, for instance, was engaged in an alarming amount of infringing activity. They call that red flag notice. And if there was notice enough that, okay, this person is doing a lot of unauthorized downloading of music, then the service could do something about that. They would grant the service the right to step in and either stop the usage, take the person off their platform or whatnot. But this was the way it was supposed to work. The burden was on the copyright owner to inform the copyright user of the infringement, and it was the copyright user that was going to take it down, and they were given a safe harbor. And in 1977, it worked, and then along came YouTube, and everything changed. The burden now is still on the copyright owner, and the biggest problem that has arisen is, and I'm sure many of you have heard this term, it has created what's called a whack-a-mole problem, which is that a party would send a takedown notice, the work would come down, and it would pop up someplace else immediately. And then it would come down again after another notice was sent, and then it would pop up over there and over there, over there, thus the whack-a-mole problem that you can never bring your works down because it's always going to be reposted in one way or another. Now, during the roundtable hearings and in the comments, the copyright owners, including the music community, they didn't call for repeal of the DMCA, they called for a recalibration. Essentially, what they were asking for was that pro-copyright protections be reinvigorated, and they wanted the burden of policing the internet to shift back more to the user and not solely on the side of the copyright owner. The smaller copyright community, those without the resources at all to fight this, were the most critical and vocal in this. The independent labels, the independent songwriter groups. These are folks who fought hard to make a point, and many movie producers, small independent movie producers, they wanted to make the point that the DMCA is worthless to them. One submitter that I represented, and I actually attached a letter to the submission that we made on behalf of the music community, told the story that the failure of the DMCA partially led to their disbanding of their indie label because they believed they could no longer protect the interests of their artists. And they have disbanded that label. And they were so fed up with the idea that a copyright law would pass that does not protect their interests. Effectively, they were saying that I can go out there and have my rights, but I have no remedy. Why create the work if I have no? I might as well create it and just give it away. And once it's up there, it just goes. Now, the user community, including Google, believes the DMCA is working fine. Next year, there's going to be close to 1 billion takedown notices filed, and Google's fine with that because they have a safe harbor, they have a system in place that, yes, they can respond to these notice and takedowns, but essentially they don't believe anything should change. Now, YouTube argues that their content ID system has greatly improved the takedown system, and to a degree it has. I don't think to a degree that they're arguing, but it has helped. But that doesn't have anything to do with everybody else dealing with this particular platforms that offers music. The user community also criticized abusive DMCA practices, meaning every once in a while a copyright owner might send out a takedown notice where they actually don't own the product. When that happens, I have no idea, but they're saying it does. And they also claim that, well, some of the use might be fair use, and therefore the copyright owner shouldn't do that. They should basically refrain if it's fair use. We'll get to the Lens case in a second, all about that. But within this hearing, the user community submitted a study that concluded that 30% of all takedown notices are quote-unquote suspect. This was strongly criticized by the copyright pundits at the hearing, pointing out that in one example, I actually pointed this out, a suspect notice is sent to someone using a cover version of a song without a license, and they claimed that that was a suspect takedown notice, totally ignoring the fact that under Section 115, you can get a license to make a cover version of a song. So the idea that you see a cover version of one of your songs and you're sending out a takedown notice, these folks believe that, well, that's suspect. That might not be real in one way or another. They also discussed the Lens case, and this is the case with the dancing baby at the, whatever it is, the birthday party with the cake and all of this and the Prince track, and whether or not that was fair use. And in the Lens case, which I think is going to end up in the Supreme Court, they ruled that a copyright owner must take into account whether or not the use is fair before you send out a takedown notice. This was talked about in the context of Congress should somehow step in and override this problem. At this point, they're not going to, because it is going to probably be going to the Supreme Court, but it does stand out there as an example of how onerous the position they have put the copyright owner in. Fair use is a defense, and they have flipped it totally to make it into an affirmative position of the copyright owner that they must take into account the intent and the use of somebody else, the user, which is almost impossible. And yet this is how the court ruled in the Ninth Circuit, and I hope that this will be overturned. The goal of the copyright community in the study was to press Congress to amend the DMCA so that they would shift the burden somewhat back to the copyright user as opposed to with the copyright owner, and to eliminate the problem. Rhetorically, we've been using the term, we need a notice and stay down process as opposed to a notice and take down. And that one way to solve this is to give some kind of force, legal force, to a provision in the DMCA called representative lists. And that perhaps small labels or publishers could provide a list of their product and their works to a user and say that if in fact you see this being used, don't wait for a takedown notice, just take it down. I think that if there's going to be any change, this is going to be it. There's going to be a lot of pushback from the services as to, well, what if it's fair use, and what if they don't own it, and what if it's relicensed? There's many problems that you have to work out, but nevertheless, without this change, there's going to be no usage of the DMCA by smaller copyright owners in the future. They will only use it by the major companies who have put an amazing amount of resources into this. And this is where the future lies, in some kind of legislative fix to the DMCA. After the hearings, there's going to be reply comments. We'll get involved in that. And then the Copyright Office will issue its report, and they will deliver that to Congress. Hopefully some in Congress will propose some legislation to fix the DMCA. I have heard that Congressman Goodlatte is very interested in looking at this, but then again, he hasn't had the visits from Google like he's had the visits from the content community. So we'll see how that plays out at the end of the day. So that is the second big issue in my mind that's going on in Washington that you should know about. Any questions on the DMCA at this point? Yeah.
I've heard criticism that the DMCA is actually hurt fair use a lot, especially with the anti-circumvention provisions of it, that you can no longer do things you might have been able to do before, just like beta-batch, time shifting, whatever. Just to even reverse engineer something or to copy something for your own use, you can no longer do that without running afoul of the DRM that's on it. That's kind of stifling.
Yeah, and I think that's way overblown. I understand the problem. I understand the point. In the DMCA and in the copyright law, there are provisions that they go through every few years where they allow exceptions to circumvention, to anti-circumvention. That's what the kind of the backstop that Congress put in to address your point, which is that if you think a certain use should allow for circumvention of a DRM technology, then take it to the Copyright Office and Congress, and the Copyright Office is bound to move forward, and every year they have issued more exemptions. So that is, in my mind, the way to solve the anti-circumvention. I understand people want to use it on all platforms, and they don't want people to go in and, kind of be violative of and infringing if they disable certain things, within a technology. But there are already provisions in the copyright law that allow for exceptions to be found and carve-outs, and that's going on a lot. And many of them are legit. There's issues with blind people. Where you have to allow for certain kinds of changes in DRM to allow the usage for them, and the Copyright Office is open to that, and I know no one in the copyright community who's against that. So I think the process does have outlets on that. Is there another hand on DMCA? Yeah.
Just addressing the whack-a-mole problem, you suggested instead of a notice and take down, a notice and stay down. How, because of the internet is just so vast, how would you propose for something to stay down? Unless, are you?
Well, I'm in favor of jail for a long time. No, I'm not. That was a joke. That might be a little too much of a remedy. No. Yeah, no, I understand. That's a big issue. And I think, again, the answer is that I think in the representative list concept, which is that you would, it would not apply to everybody in the internet, it would apply to the services that you provide the representative list to. So if you have a certain number of products, BMG, they got a heck of a lot of copyrights, but you got a pretty good sense of what they own, hopefully. On most days, I think they know what they own. That you would somehow provide a list to a service, Apple, Amazon, and with instructions that clearly these are tracks, these are files, we'll give you certain identifiers to make sure that you're getting the right one, because they're all tacking on music identifiers. If you see this, then you take it down. If a company doesn't give a representative list, then no one's responsible for it taken down. I think that, again, it's a proactive approach on the copyright owner side to give a representative list of their works. But if they do, then the users, the services should comply. And they should be responsible for some type of proactive taking down of music that's owned by others. It is the only way, in my estimation, that you can solve the whack-a-mole problem. If they don't do something, the DMCA will be unusable for other than the big companies, for nobody who owns music. It will be like you release your song, it's gone. You have no remedy. And if you even decide to go after somebody, well, they have the safe harbor, which is there's no liability. I think the representative list is the answer to this. Tough to do, but to keep the status quo is even worse at this point. And if anybody has been involved in sending takedown notices for companies they represent, you'll know what I'm talking about. It is a frustrating, unbelievably time-consuming and wasteful exercise to send out 100 notices on one little song or one little track and get no response. I've known people that run indie labels and publishers who used to have staffs to do that and now have gotten rid of them, saying that why am I, flushing good money after bad and all of that. So I think that's where the answer is on that particular point. Okay, let me get into something now, the third topic, and I'll go through this very quickly, but you should all know about the American Law Institute's initiative to create a restatement of copyright law. I don't know how many of you in the litigation side use restatements. I think, they're used, my understanding is, a lot in many different areas. But usually it's restatements dealing with common law. Because what you're trying to do, what the American Law Institute was always worried about is, okay, you've got a lot of common law, you got all the state law, you got this and that. Let's compile it into some kind of publication that will give guidance to judges, guidance to clerks and lawyers on what the law is in one way or another. It's a way to kind of take away some ambiguity that you might have. They have never, ever addressed a statute like this. They've addressed small little statutes, Foreign Corrupt Services Act, and a couple other things like that. But now they're addressing the copyright law. This has caused an incredible amount of controversy, and it is another example of the ongoing battle between those who are in favor of copyright law and those who want to push back against it. This initiative was started by Pam Samuelson, professor somewhere, I can't remember the exact school in California, but of course it had to be California. But she is really the heir apparent to Lawrence Lessig, and she believed that clearly Congress was not going to amend the Copyright Act in the digital age in a way that she felt was appropriate, so she petitioned effectively the American Law Institute, which is out of Philadelphia, to start a restatement of copyright. And she got a lot of support from that from other professors who agreed with her position. And they have pressed forward with this proposal, and they have created a group, what they call directors, who will actually draft the restatement, but they've also opened the door and they've created an advisory committee who will advise them. Well, to this and to their credit, they put a lot of pro-copyright people on this committee, as well as those who believe that it should be much more expansive for the user. They put on folks from Google, they put on folks from Cablevision and many of the other companies, but they also have some of the top academics in favor of stronger copyright. David Nimmer is on this group. Jane Ginsburg from Columbia, Justice Ginsburg's daughter, who really, I think, advises Justice Ginsburg on copyright law more than anything else, and which is why Justice Ginsburg is the most pro-copyright justice I think we've ever seen. Maybe you can go back at Oliver Wendell Holmes. You could make an argument. He was the guy that created public performance rights in a lot of ways. But bottom line here is that there's pro-copyright folks in the room. I am in the room. Steve Marks from the RIAA, and on and on. So we start this process by saying, don't do it. This is wrong, because you're going to get it wrong, because you have a copyright law that has been passed where every word passed by Congress is there for a reason. Who are you, the American Law Institute, to step in and say it should be different or interpret it different, or we're going to use another word than what's in the copyright law? The Copyright Office was very critical of this and came to this first meeting they had with the advisors saying that we are tasked with advising Congress on copyright law, not you. What if we differ? You're going to give something to a judge that differs from what we're saying copyright law is, and we're advising Congress on these matters? This is the level of controversy that has occurred. The ALI, got to remember, they're a publisher. They sell these restatements, and they're really expensive. If you're working a law firm and you buy them, you know how expensive they are. They've gone down this road. They want to make it happen. So they went through one aspect of it, one chapter, and they're going to do chapter by chapter of the restatement. And it was very controversial, and we're going to continue this down the road. The point is that many folks in the copyright community are trying to make this more transparent. We really can't divulge the actual drafts of this because there's some sense to, you want the drafts to change and all that, and it's not law and you don't want it out there. But the bottom line is that they are going to continue with this process, and they will eventually, maybe years down the road, publish a restatement of copyright that may not reflect what many pro-copyright attorneys or judges believe. I agree with them that judges don't understand copyright to a large extent. I think Judge Lavelle, who created the fair use theory years ago, I thought he understood copyright until I had the chance to have dinner with him and sat next to him and talked about copyright all night. Now I'm not so sure. And he told me basically, I want this restatement to give to my clerk, because I'm not sure about copyright and the digital age, but I want them to know what's going on. Raising the point, if you get it wrong, we are going to have case after case ruling in the wrong way, ruling contrary to what Congress possibly believes, ruling contrary to what the Copyright Office possibly believes, and you will have decisions that are just totally wrong and really a change in legislation, not by Congress, but by the ALI. Very controversial thing. I just wanted to raise it to let you know about it and that you can follow it. There will be, I'm sure, a lot of press coming in the next few months as Chapter 2 is released to the advisory committee for us to really delve into. And this is the chapter that will deal with the biggest issue, and that is fair use. What is and what is not fair use. This will be the most contentious issue moving forward in the copyright world, is the fight over fair use. After the Google case, Google, again, with the Authors Guild, one can argue that fair use has nothing to do with the theories that were applied and accepted a couple decades ago. Under the Google theory, it is, if the use helps our culture, if the use helps our nation, it's fair. And putting aside the ownership rights and the other rights, like human rights of the songwriters, the artists, the publishers, the labels. Very important stuff at the end of the day. I'm trying to just move on quickly. I just want to touch base on international. Any of you possibly might have followed a couple years ago the controversy over some treaties called SOPA and PIPA, which had to do with expanding copyright into an international realm. Everybody thought that these were non-controversial. They were just trying to have enforcement of copyright in more uniform, more harmonized, better enforcement, and on and on. The user community, the pro-tech community, engaged in a lot of digital activism to defeat those, and they were defeated. Well, along comes TPP. If you watch the Democratic convention, you saw those great TPP signs. Now, those issues that Bernie cares about, if anybody feels the burn in here, those issues have to do with trade and with jobs. And I get it. I understand all of that. What has not been discussed in any way is the pro-copyright and the pro-artist and songwriter provisions of the TPP that will not be put in place because they're going to defeat it. And they're not going to pass it out of Congress. Congress, Senate in particular, has to approve this. So the administration, and in all treaties, the administration goes and negotiates a treaty, and then they bring it back to Congress for approval. One of the controversies and one of the criticisms was, well, it was done in secret. It's like all treaties are done in secret. This is how they work. You can't negotiate a treaty with another country in the press or even in Congress. Congress has a shot at it after the treaty is submitted to them. So the TPP is one of these treaties that is now in front of Congress for all sorts of deliberation, and you have arguments in favor and arguments against on the copyright side. There are folks out there who really got out front and fought this. On the in favor, you'll hear folks talking about, oh, it's going to be very important so that U.S. products and services will flow into foreign markets, including copyrighted works, and they'll have high standards of copyright protection and enforcement. And if there's not, the treaty provides you with a process to contest that. It's just like many international treaties. You take your problems with trade to different kinds of establishments, maybe an arbitration system that will fight it out in one way or another. Many pro-TPP proponents have said that, in particular, in the Trans-Pacific region, you have some countries that really have big copyright problems, and that if those countries sign on to this treaty, they will be able to, the United States, including the United States copyright owners, will be able to fight this out in a process that's set up. 4 countries in particular were constantly, talked about: New Zealand, Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia. What a group there. That really is not protecting copyright much, and the TPP will help foster greater harmonization of term and provide those countries with protecting their rights vis-a-vis the United States, as well as the United States protecting the rights of U.S. copyright holders in their jurisdictions. And this will certainly allow enforcement procedures to be updated. Now, the arguments against, it was secretive. It's a multinational trade agreement, and they're all bad. It's going to have a massive negative impact on freedom of expression, freedom of privacy, due process. They really fought hard against the idea that this particular treaty might increase enforcement in these other countries, which is exactly what copyright owners want. They were against all of that. They hated the fact that all the countries signing had to agree to the term, which is life plus 70 years. Some countries don't abide by that. And one thing you want in a copyright treaty is harmonization of term. so that everybody knows, as the guys who work for publishers know, it's really hard to work with a world where some states, some countries have terms that are life plus 50 and others that have life plus 70. It's really tough. And you don't want to have that. So harmonization is part of all of this, but they don't like that. And certainly they didn't like that the TPP adopted criminal sanctions for copyright infringement, and that they felt this was an overreach by the copyright owners. This is just an example in DC where copyright issues of the copyleft versus copyright even flow into international relations. And one has to really be careful that your efforts to improve copyright internationally are not stopped by those engaging in treaties that really fall under this, hey, all these trade agreements are bad. They're not all bad. And some of the provisions in them aren't bad. And you have to really parse that out. So that's kind of what's happening on the international. One quick point on Web 4, and then I'll tell you what I think is going to pass in the next term. Web 4, which is under the Section 114 CRB procedure, recently went through, Web 4 is the name of a proceeding, they recently went through a proceeding in front of the Copyright Royalty Board, where the Copyright Royalty Board, in a very controversial move, because these are new judges in Washington, ruled in ways that it adopted economic theories that are not normally used in the music community. And to give you the example of the biggest controversy, in a Copyright Royalty Board proceeding, just so you understand, they set rates. They set rates by looking at metrics that are created in the free market. And whatever the rate is, some of the sides that want to increase the rate will come in and argue the rate should be increased because of this particular deal or that particular deal. Others will say, no, it should be decreased because of this deal. I want to focus on one deal that was used as a metric in Web 4, the Merlin deal, which had to do with a whole bunch of indie labels, and I understand why they did it. They went into a deal that said, we'll take a lower royalty from a service, but that service has to do something in addition to just paying us. They've got to do something called steering. They've got to steer the users of the service towards my works, towards the indie labels. It made perfect sense when they did it. And you know, on a certain level, that's smart. You know, they're saying, I want the rate and maybe a little bit lower than normal, but if you can send more people to us, then we're going to make more money at the end of the day. And that agreement was placed into evidence in front of the CRB, and the labels and the artist said, you've got to take into account, yes, there's a lower rate, but the steerage part offsets that lower rate. And it should mean that you either increase the rates or keep them the way they are. What the judges did was take into account the lower rate and ignore the steerage under an economic theory that has nothing to do with music. This was the controversy of this particular CRB, and that everyone is very afraid, and this is on appeal, and they may overturn it because of this application. But these are new judges under the CRB, and they are very peculiar about they want to create a court in their image, and they are going to apply these economic theories in ways that will not make the copyright community happy on any level, which gets us to the point of, well, maybe we should just settle out and not go to the CRB proceeding. Some folks have settled out under the Section 115 proceeding, others have not, and you're going to see this, I think, as more of a push towards the industries making deals in the free market, collective opt-in deals that will allow parties to opt into these rates and not go through the Copyright Royalty Board as the place that sets these rates in one way or another. That's just a little example of the controversy within the CRB relating to the way that they handle everything. Now, last point in conclusion. What's going to happen with the elections? I have no frickin' idea, but I know this. I would think that the House is going to stay Republican. Means that those in power right now in the judiciary committees will stay. I don't see that changing. I see it getting tighter, but I don't see it changing. In the Senate, I'm going to, predict it's going to be 50-50, which means that whoever is elected president will own the Senate. The Senate has always been, because there have been pro-copyright and pro-music senators, in particular guys like Orrin Hatch, who I'm sure many of you have heard the old story about Orrin Hatch wrote a song, and they hooked him up with ASCAP, and he got royalties, and now he's seen the light and all of that. Well, I got a lot of problems with Rick Carnes at times, but boy, when he walked in with a guitar and said, Orrin, what do you think about this song? And all of a sudden, Orrin was a co-writer, and that kind of started that, man, you got to give Rick his due for making Orrin Hatch a co-writer of songs and thus a recipient of ASCAP rates. The guy's pretty smart. That was good politics in Capitol Hill. I think that I don't see anything in the Senate that shows that there's going to be a lot of anti-copyright folks involved, but you never know at the end of the day. So that gets back to, okay, you have the election, what's going to pass, what's not going to pass. I think that if there's anything that's going to pass, and you should follow this closely because it will matter to some of your clients, is the Small Claims Copyright Court. This might be real, and it's going to come out of the Copyright Office, and it is a voluntary court. It's almost like an arbitration, meaning that if you've got a user and a copyright owner wanting to resolve their differences without having to go to federal court cheaply and maybe even remotely, they may do this through their computers to a certain extent, and you give the rights for this court to handle your complaint, but there is a cap on damages. That's the key with small claims court. That might be a viable option for many people and your clients who don't want to file a federal case because of all the problems. I think the Copyright Office relocation bill will also be passed. They may move the Copyright Office out of the Library of Congress and create a separate agency for the Copyright Office. This will help them. It will help them modernize. It will help them get those old cards. If you've ever been to the Copyright Office and you needed to go and research an old work, they send you back into this room. It kind of looked like the room, in some of the movies with, like Indiana Jones, where they open up the big, the doors and they have all of this stuff on shelves. Well, at the Copyright Office, if you want to go back to the 1930s, you're going to be with little cards. Nobody's ever digitized this old stuff. That's how you research your copyright, on these old little cards, looking for, evidence of chain of title. And chain of title is a big issue with copyright litigation today. So they're going to try and modernize that, but they're going to have to get out of the library because they're just not going to have the kind of resources in the library. It may mean that they are no longer a legislative branch, but I think that will pass. The DMCA reform, there's a shot. I would say 50-50 that you might have a notice of stay down bill at least being introduced. Everything else, gridlock. Talk, hearings, reports. We're making our record. I would say the 76 law that was passed, they started doing the process of copyright reform in 1955. Right now, I think we're at 1965. Everybody's making their record as to what they want, what they don't want, and it will be up to future Congresses to enact a lot of what of these changes are going to be, but it's not going to be in the next congressional session. It's going to be down the road. In general, as a conclusion, the wars between the copyright and the copyleft will continue in earnest. They will not abide. There is not going to be common ground to a large extent, except amongst those folks who try to work out deals on the Hill. But then you open it up, and digital activism could destroy everything. And lobbying money can destroy everything that people work on to have some kind of a consensus. I'm not, really looking forward to seeing that happen, but I think it's going to happen. Meaning that you might think that your copyright bill or your point is absolutely legitimate, and you might be cut down because of people getting online and either flaming you or contacting their congressman in one way or another. This dynamic has always occurred in the public performance world of radio. They always say, well, why don't artists have the right to get paid for radio airplay? Not internet radio airplay. They get paid for that through Sound Exchange, but radio airplay. If you're a terrestrial radio station and you're playing something, only songwriters are getting paid. Why is that happening? And they always say, why can't Congress get it right? It's because there are a couple of congressmen in the districts of the publishers, of the labels, of the motion picture companies, but there's a radio station in every district. And those radio stations, through the National Association of Broadcasters, they consistently lobby against this, and they have consistently won, even though the rest of the world pays recording artists. We are the only country, I think they always argue, it's like us in Iran or something like that, who don't pay recording artists, or North Korea, a real bad guy. But we don't, and it's because of lobbying and power that one has in Washington. As a final word, they always say that, size matters in D.C. When you go to the National Association of Broadcasters, they have a giant building, the NAB at the top. The Motion Picture Association, they've got a nice building. Not as big, but a nice building. The RIAA, they got a couple of floors in a building. The NMPA has one floor. The recording artists have a basement. And the songwriters, I don't think, have anything. Size matters in D.C. And that's how it's going to continue to play out in the future. And the best thing you can do for your clients is just to understand it and explain to them that it's not your fault. It's someone else's fault. Okay, so I've gone over a lot. If anybody has any questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next panel. Okay, you've had enough of public policy. There will be no quiz on this, by the way, at the end. So thank you very much. And now we're going to